He was the kind of man people called reliable. The one who answered the phone, stayed late, remembered birthdays, softened every sharp edge in the room. He listened more than he spoke. He apologized before anyone asked. He believed that if he kept life peaceful, life would eventually reward him with love, respect, and a place that felt like home. But peace has a hidden cost when it is purchased with self-betrayal. From the outside, his life looked stable enough. A decent job, a few polite friendships, a relationship that never quite turned into intimacy, but never fully ended either. People trusted him because he never made things difficult. Yet inside, something was quietly rotting. Every time he said yes while meaning no, every time he swallowed an opinion to avoid tension, every time he smiled while feeling invisible, a small wound deepened. Not dramatic, not obvious, just steady, silent, exhausting. If you had asked his coworkers, they would have described him as a good man. Dependable, easy to work with, maybe a little too agreeable but harmless. If you had asked the woman he loved, she might have said he was kind, thoughtful, and safe, but also strangely hard to know. If you had asked him, he would have hesitated before answering, because even he was no longer sure where his kindness ended and his fear began. He sat in meetings where others took credit for his ideas and nodded without a fight. He listened to friends unload their problems for the 100th time and told them, "Don't worry about it." Even when he was the one carrying the weight, he gave and gave, hoping that one day someone would look at him and say, "You matter." But the more he overextended himself, the more invisible he became. And that is the cruel twist of the nice guy life. The world often rewards your silence by asking for more of it. Somewhere deep inside, resentment began to gather. Not as rage at first, but as fatigue. A heaviness in the chest. A tight jaw. A sense that life was moving on without him. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that good men do not complain. Good men do not cause scenes. Good men keep the peace. Yet the truth was already pressing against the walls of his consciousness, waiting to be seen. Have you ever known a man like that? Or perhaps recognized him in yourself? Because sooner or later, the mask of niceness stops protecting you, and the life you thought you were building begins to reveal the price you paid to hold it together. At first, no one calls him weak. They call him pleasant, dependable, easy to work with. In the office, he laughs at jokes that sting. At home, he swallows his irritation and tells himself it is maturity. He answers late-night messages, takes on the extra favor, stays quiet when the room gets tense. From the outside, it almost looks like virtue. From the inside, it feels like being slowly erased. And that is the first angle of the story, the world's view. To everyone else, he is the nice guy, the safe man, the one who never makes trouble. People trust him because he asks for nothing. They lean on him because he rarely refuses. They praise his calmness, not realizing it is often fear wearing a polite face. He has mistaken being useful for being valued. But there is another angle, one he hides even from himself. On the drive home, alone with the headlights and the silence, the smile falls off his face. He replays every moment he stayed quiet. He remembers the comment he should have corrected, the request he wanted to decline, the boundary he let cross because he did not want to seem difficult. And beneath the politeness, something heavy begins to harden. Not strength, resentment. This is the part many men know but rarely admit. The pain does not always arrive as anger. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, as numbness, as the quiet bitterness of a man who gives and gives, then wonders why he feels invisible. He tells himself he is being patient, generous, understanding, yet deep down he is bargaining for love with self-abandonment, and the price keeps rising. From a third angle, the deeper truth appears. The world did not make him powerless. He practiced powerlessness until it became his identity. Every time he avoided a difficult conversation, he trained himself to fear his own voice. Every time he said yes with a clenched jaw, he taught himself that his discomfort mattered less than other people's approval. Little by little, he built a life where everyone could see him but nobody had to respect him. There is a subtle cruelty in that kind of living. Not because he is cruel to others, but because he is cruel to himself. He keeps peace on the surface while unrest grows underneath. He becomes the man who is never blamed, but also never truly known. And then one day, the cost becomes impossible to ignore. If this feels familiar, stay with it. Because the moment a man stops lying to himself is the moment his real life can begin. He looked at his life the way a courtroom might look at the same crime from 3 different witnesses. In one version, he was the dependable one, the easygoing man, the person who never made trouble. Coworkers said he was great to have around. Friends called him understanding. Even his family praised how he could always keep the peace. From the outside, it sounded like virtue. It looked like strength. But from where he stood, alone in the quiet of his apartment after another long day of swallowing his own opinion, it felt more like disappearance. At work, he watched it happen in small humiliations. A colleague handed him extra tasks with a smile that carried no apology. A manager changed deadlines without warning. A meeting dragged on, and when he tried to speak, someone interrupted him mid-sentence and the room kept moving as if his voice had never entered it. He smiled, nodded, and told himself he was being mature. He told himself conflict was for insecure men. Yet by evening, the resentment sat in his chest like a stone. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, repetitive, unforgiving. In another version of the same story, the people around him were not villains at all. They were simply responding to what he had trained them to expect. He said yes too quickly. He apologized for needing space. He made himself smaller so others could feel comfortable, then secretly blamed them for using the version of him he kept offering. That was the cruelest part of the pattern. He was both the victim and the architect of his own exhaustion. And in the deepest version, the one he had spent years avoiding, the truth was even harder. He was not kind because he was free. He was kind because he was afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of disappointment. Afraid that if he ever showed anger, firmness, or desire, he would lose love altogether. So he traded authenticity for approval and called it being a good man. Then one evening, after a rejection that landed with surgical precision, the mask finally cracked. Maybe it was a woman who chose someone louder, clearer, more grounded. Maybe it was a boss who said, with polished indifference, that he was not quite leadership material. Whatever the scene, the message was the same. The world could feel his hesitation before he ever spoke it. And for the first time, he could no longer pretend that silence was innocence. That was the beginning of the descent. Not into cruelty, but into truth. The moment a man stops asking, "How do I keep everyone happy?" and starts asking, "Why am I abandoning myself to do it?" If this is hitting close to home, stay with me because what comes next is the part most men never learn how to face. At work, he kept smiling through the humiliation. He laughed at jokes that cut too deep, accepted tasks that were never his, and watched louder men walk away with the credit he had earned in silence. From the outside, he looked dependable, even admirable. The kind of man who never caused trouble. But inside, something had begun to rot. At home, the same pattern repeated. He answered, "It's fine," when it wasn't fine. He said sure when his body wanted to say no. He apologized for needing time, space, respect. And every time he did, a quiet resentment gathered behind his ribs like storm clouds with nowhere to break. He told himself he was being mature, peaceful, good. But the truth was more painful. He was disappearing in plain sight. Then one afternoon, the world answered him with a cruelty he could not laugh off. A meeting, a room full of polished voices. His idea, one he had carefully shaped for weeks, was presented by someone else as if it had been theirs all along. There was a pause, then nods, then applause. He felt the room tilt. Someone glanced at him and said, "You'll understand, right? You're such a team player." That sentence landed like a sentence of its own. Team player. Translation: invisible, agreeable, safe to use. He smiled again. Of course he did. But something in him cracked open. Later, alone in the car, the rage arrived. Not the loud, heroic rage of movies, but the shameful kind. The kind a good man hides from himself. Why didn't I speak? Why didn't I claim what was mine? Why do I keep teaching people that I have no edges? In that moment, he saw it from another angle. The world had not simply overlooked him. It had adapted to the version of him that never resisted. This is the brutal truth of the nice guy trap. People often do not respect the boundaryless man because he has trained them not to. And yet, even this is not the final truth. Beneath the anger was fear. Fear of being called difficult. Fear of losing approval. Fear that if he showed his real backbone, he would become the very thing he had been taught to hate. That is where Jung enters the story, not as a preacher of hardness, but as a guide into wholeness. The shadow, Jung would say, is not only cruelty and selfishness. It is also the strength you have disowned because you were told it was dangerous. The capacity to say, "No, that is not acceptable." The capacity to disappoint others without collapsing. The capacity to stand still while the room tests you. And maybe that is the question that now hangs in the air. How many years has this man called his fear kindness? How much of his life has been surrendered in the name of being easy to love? If this is speaking to you, stay with me, because what comes next is not about becoming harsh. It is about becoming unmistakable. At first, the pain did not look like pain. It looked like patience. It looked like being easy to work with, easy to love, easy to overlook. He smiled when he wanted to speak. He nodded when his chest tightened. And he kept telling himself that one more sacrifice would finally make everything feel safe. But safety never came. Only exhaustion did. At work, his ideas were repeated by louder voices. In relationships, his needs were treated like optional suggestions. Even in friendship, he became the man everyone called when they needed help, but rarely when he needed anything real. And because he had spent so many years being agreeable, he had no language for the quiet humiliation building inside him. He did not call it betrayal. He called it being understanding. But understanding, when it is not balanced by self-respect, becomes a prison with soft walls. From one angle, the world saw a good man. Reliable, gentle, non treatening. From another angle, his family saw someone who never caused trouble. Someone who made life smoother by disappearing a little more each year. And from the deepest angle, the one he refused to face, he was a man slowly abandoning himself in exchange for the illusion of being chosen. That is the hidden cost of the nice guy role. Not kindness, not compassion. Those are strengths. The cost is the fear underneath them. The fear of disapproval. The fear of conflict. The fear that if he said what he really felt, he would lose everything. So he learned to manage people instead of meet them honestly. He learned to be useful instead of true. And eventually, life answered him with a painful clarity. Maybe it was a moment in a meeting where his work was dismissed without a second glance. Maybe it was a woman he cared about telling him she respected him, but did not feel anything deeper. Maybe it was the look in his own eyes one morning, as he stood in the bathroom and realized he could no longer recognize the man staring back. Whatever form it took, the message was the same. The world cannot respect a man who will not stand inside his own truth. That is where the shadow begins to speak. Not as rage, not as cruelty, but as a buried force asking to be claimed. The part of him that knew how to say no. The part that could hold eye contact. The part that no longer needed permission to exist. Jung would say this is where individuation begins, when a man stops performing goodness and starts becoming whole. If this is hitting close to home, take a moment and give this a quiet like. Not for the algorithm, for the truth of it. Because the real question is not whether you are nice enough. The question is, where have you been betraying yourself to keep other people comfortable? And if you have been living that way for years, the next step may be the most difficult one yet. And so, after all the silence, all the smiling, all the self-erasure, he finally understands the truth. The pain was never only coming from the world. It was also coming from the part of him that kept begging to be accepted by it. He had spent years calling it kindness, calling it patience, calling it maturity. But in the quiet after the rejection, in the cold light of the empty office or the sleepless room, he can see it now for what it was. Fear. Fear of being disliked. Fear of being seen. Fear of losing what little approval he had managed to earn by disappearing. That is the moment the old man inside him dies. Not in some dramatic explosion, but in a calm and terrible realization. He no longer wants to live on his knees. He no longer wants to offer his dignity as payment for temporary peace. The world does not suddenly become softer. People do not suddenly become fair. But something deeper changes. He stops asking, "How do I make everyone comfortable with me?" and starts asking, "What is true?" That question becomes his anchor, his spine, his return. From the outside, it may look small. A steady voice, a direct answer, a boundary spoken without apology. A simple "No, I can't do that." But for a man who has lived too long as a shadow of himself, that sentence is revolutionary. It is the sound of a soul taking its place in the room. It is the end of self-betrayal disguised as politeness. Jung would say this is the beginning of individuation. Not becoming perfect, not becoming cold, becoming whole. The shadow is no longer the enemy. It is a teacher. The anger he buried becomes clarity. The resentment he swallowed becomes discernment. The silence he used as a mask becomes a conscious choice, not a prison. And in that transformation, he discovers something most men are never taught. Strength is not the ability to endure everything. Strength is the courage to define what you will no longer tolerate. If the story hit close to home, give it a like quietly and without performance. And ask yourself honestly, where in your life have you been saying yes just to avoid being rejected? Because the next step is not becoming harder. It is becoming truer. And once a man learns to stand in his own truth, everything that was built on his weakness begins to change.